Okay, now let's talk about management and deployment tools of Azure. In this module, we are going to talk about describing the Azure Portal, which we already know what is Azure Portal because we have used it. Then the other tools which are Azure Cloud Shell, including Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell. Now, I think in one of our demo, we have seen Azure Cloud Shell also, which is already available inside the Azure Portal itself. And if you do not want to use that thing within Azure Portal browser, then Azure CLI is a command line utility which you can install in your Windows machines or in other machines, and then you can fire the same Azure commands with that. Then we are going to describe the purpose of Azure Arc, which is a centralized utility when you have to manage your resources across multi-cloud and on-premise. And then finally, we have to understand Azure Resource Manager, ARM, and then whatever things which are associated with Azure ARM templates. Now, whenever we deploy something using Azure Portal, it is ultimately creating an ARM template in the background, which is nothing but a JSON based template. We'll discuss about this in this particular video. First, we have four kind of tools for interacting with Azure: Portal, PowerShell, Cloud Shell, and CLI. Now, all four are super easy to use, but most people get confused with that. So let's discuss this. Azure Portal is a graphical user interface, which we have used in almost most of our demos. When you have gone through the Microsoft Learn labs, most of the time they are using Azure Cloud Shell, which is a command line utility where you are just firing the command which are starting with AZ. The commands of Azure Cloud Shell and the commands of Azure CLI are exactly same. The only thing is, in Cloud Shell, you have options whether you want to use bash commands or you want to use PowerShell commands. Now, when you have a double utility available in Azure Cloud Shell, if you are a developer, if you are someone who wants to deploy some resources like containers or Kubernetes kind of resources, you are mostly going to prefer Azure Cloud Shell. But suppose if you are an administrator and you do not want to use bash, but you are expert in PowerShell scripting, you want to execute PowerShell scripts to maybe create multiple virtual machines or scalable virtual machines like virtual machine skill sets, then I think you're going to use Azure PowerShell, which is again a client-side utility. Inside a PowerShell, you can directly execute Azure commands. Azure PowerShell is comparatively an older way to execute commands, while the newer one is your Azure CLI, which is again going to use similar kind of commands of Azure Bash. This CLI is one of the latest way to use through commands. In that also you can create patch files or scripting configuration kind of thing, where set of commands will be executed in one shot. If you ask me, out of these four tools, which one is the widely used? Obviously Azure Portal, because it has a graphical user interface. Initially everyone learn Azure resources with Azure Portal. But then based on the role, if they are administrators, if they are someone who are security administrators, they're mostly going to go with the commands, and that is something which is an easier way because it is going to be automated using the scripting, and there are less chances of human errors in commands. That's the reason the other tools are useful. Now, we have something which is known as Azure Arc. From AZ-900 exam point of view, this is just an introduction of Azure Arc. You do not need to do deep dive. One page description of Azure Arc which is available on Microsoft Learn, that is more than enough. Azure Arc is actually a tool from Microsoft whenever you are using and managing hybrid and multi-cloud environments that can rapidly get complicated. Azure provides a host of tools for provisioning and configuring and monitoring Azure resources. Whether you have resources on-premise or whether you have a hybrid configuration which is connected with that on the cloud, Azure Arc can manage that. Azure Arc provides a centralized unified way to manage your entire environment together by protecting your existing non-Azure resources into an Azure Resource Manager model. You can see in the diagram right now, on the center of the diagram we have ARM, Azure Resource Manager. On the right side you have your on-premise or multi-cloud and edge resources, which can have a Kubernetes cluster, virtual machines or database kind of resources in that. And those resources are now extended to the Azure management, and then you are actually able to manage this thing at a centralized place inside Azure Arc. What kind of things which can be there outside the Azure Arc? Well, you can have servers, Kubernetes cluster, Azure data services, databases like SQL servers, and virtual machines. Now all of this can be outside the Azure Arc. Still you can manage them using the tools which are available inside the Azure Arc. These tools are mostly going to be managed by Azure Portal, PowerShell, and Azure CLI. And if you ask me what exactly you're going to do inside that, well, you can do all those things which are mentioned inside this. You can do management of these tools. You can configure custom locations as an abstraction layer on top of your Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster. And you can also extend it. That is what Azure Arc is all about. Nothing much. Let's move forward to next. Now we have Azure Resource Manager, formerly known as ARM. This provides a management layer that enables you to create and update and delete resources in your subscription. Whenever you create any resource in Azure Portal, it is automatically going to create an Azure Resource Manager template, which is nothing but an ARM template. Well, right now, in spite of talking about template, I want you to know that ARM, Azure Resource Manager, is one of the way to manage your resources. Actually, most people do not know, but in older days, we were not having ARM kind of a model in Azure. When Azure Cloud was invented, it was having a classic model where there was no resource group. There was nothing like ARM template. But then later on, when we got the newer portal and the architectural level changes happened in Azure Cloud, they came up with the Azure Resource Manager model. This is one of the best way to manage your resources in the resource groups, and then you can manage it, create it, update it, or delete it using that. When you are using ARM template, which I told you that it's a JSON file, ultimately it allows you to use and deploy that infrastructure as a code. That's the reason the term infrastructure as a code is coming into the picture. You can ensure the consistency of your deployment across your cloud ecosystem, because if your template is properly configured, it can allow you to deploy it across multiple environments without any human errors. You can manage the configuration at scale. Maybe with one template, I can deploy 20 virtual machines. You can rapidly provision an additional environments based on the standard configuration and build. In simple words, one time you have to take a pain to configure your proper template using infrastructure as a code, but later on, reusing the same template, you can deploy multiple resources. If you have heard about tools like Ansible, Terraform, Biceps, all these are tools which are coming under the criteria of infrastructure as a code, including ARM templates. Now let's talk about ARM templates. These templates are nothing but JSON file. As I told you, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is mostly a key value pair kind of a format file that can be used to create and deploy Azure infrastructure without having to write any programming language commands into that. Whenever we are creating any resources in Azure, it is going to create this file, and that is going to have a template specific configuration inside that. It has a declarative syntax, repeatable results. You can have parameter configurations inside that so that you can customize things. You're going to have an orchestration, modular files association with that. All these words looks very complex, but when you're going to see Azure Resource Manager template in Azure Portal, it looks very easy. Let me show you that. Let's say right now I'm on my Azure Portal and I'm trying to create a resource. When I try to create a resource like, let's say, virtual machine, or let me pick one of the existing virtual machine configuration like Windows Server 2019 data center, when I click on create, we all know that it's going to take me to a page where I have to provide some details of creating a new virtual machine. This configuration is having multiple tabs like basic, disk, networking, management, and whatever details I want to provide, I have to provide it here. Now let me say I want to create a new resource group called AZ-900 RG. I'm going to create a new VM which is Maruti test VM with some number, region, everything whatever is available there, I'm going to configure that. Let's say I'm going with some simple size available from the B series. I'm not going to deploy this virtual machine right now, but just want you to see that whatever choices you are selecting here, all of this are going to be part of that template. Let me provide some username and password, and then I'm going to click on next. Now I can do all this configuration, but let me take you to the last one, which is review plus create. Whenever you go to review plus create of any particular resource deployment, I'm showing you this only for Azure Virtual Machine, but this is true for each and every deployment of Azure resources. When you go to that, at the end of this review plus create page, where it is showing you the validation and all the configurations are passed, there is a link here. You can see even right now also it is visible while the validation is going on. It is having a template that download a template for automation. Now which template they are talking about? This template is ARM template. When I click on that link, it is going to take me to a particular template. You can see this is a template, and this is actually Azure Resource Manager template. This one template is nothing but that JSON file which they have configured based on my configuration. When I go through this, it is showing me that it is around 250 lines of configuration which they have done. This configuration has 30 parameters which are maybe taken from that configuration which I have done. It has 4 variables and it has totally 5 resources which they are going to deploy, which includes my one virtual machine, one public IP address, one virtual network, network security group, and NIC. This 5 resources with all the configuration which is there is something which is redeployable. If I want to redeploy this after some time, or if I want to reuse this every day by doing the same deployment again and again, I can save this template and I can add it into library, or I can redeploy that as I want. This is what ARM template is all about. Now the syntax of ARM template, because it is JSON, it is really little tough to type actually. That's one of the reasons Microsoft has created another better version of template which is known as Bicep. Let me show you that. Bicep is a newer kind of a template which is also coming in under infrastructure as a code kind of a model. As you can see right now, Bicep is not following JSON. It has a simple programming language kind of a syntax where you're creating some parameters and you're trying to define it. It's not even programming language, it is just a simple key value pair kind of association which you're doing. If you're familiar with Ansible or Terraform, they mostly use this kind of a language and they give a different name to this language. Azure is using a word Bicep for this because this is much easier, human readable, key value pair kind of a properties which you can understand. You don't need to use Bicep, you don't need to learn Bicep in AZ-900 because it's a very basic course. But yes, you need to know that Bicep and ARM template both are extensively used to deploy your Azure resources in an automated way.